father of a respected CEO was publicly insulted by a powerful billionaire family, so his son canceled a $1 billion deal. "Sir, deliveries and staff must use the back entrance." The receptionist's sharp tone echoed across the marble lobby of the Whitmore Country Club, halting Thomas Carter's steady stride. At 63, Thomas clutched the golden invitation his son had proudly given him the day before. He wore his best Navy suit, the same one he had worn to Daniel's graduation from Harvard Business School 15 years earlier. "Excuse me, but I'm invited to my son's business lunch," he said politely. "Of course you are," replied Victoria Whitmore, the family matriarch, with a cold smile. Her heels struck the floor like a gavel delivering judgment. "Let me guess, you must be the new gardener, or perhaps a driver who lost his way." Her laughter rang out like crystal shattering, drawing curious glances from men in tailored Italian suits and women draped in old money elegance. All of them stared, savoring the spectacle. Heat burned in Thomas's neck, but he stood tall. After 4 decades as an accountant, this wasn't the first time he had been judged by appearances. "I'm Thomas Carter, father of Daniel Carter, CEO of Carter Logistics." Victoria clapped mockingly. "How sweet." The boy brought his daddy to watch how grown-ups handle real business. How touching. Across the room, Daniel Carter froze. At 38, he had turned a small family trucking company into a logistics empire worth nearly $800 million. That afternoon's billion-dollar merger with the Whitmore Group was supposed to be his crowning achievement. But watching his father mocked, the man who had raised him single-handedly after his mother's passing, ignited something cold in his chest. It was the same feeling from his childhood, when other parents dismissed his father at school meetings, assuming he had nothing to offer. Thomas remained silent, but Daniel knew that expression well. It was the look of a man who had once worked 3 jobs so his son could attend private school, who had sold his own car so Daniel could buy his first delivery truck, who had sacrificed without complaint to give his son every chance he never had. Still, Victoria pressed on with her cruel display, unaware that security cameras and even some guest phones were recording every word. "I'm sure there's some yard work available out back if you're looking for a job," she sneered. "Or maybe something in the kitchen." One of Whitmore's partners laughed loudly, muttering about knowing his place. The whispers spread, a circle of humiliation closing in. That's when Daniel stepped forward. He placed a steady arm around his father's shoulders, looked directly at Victoria, and spoke calmly. Yet his words silenced the entire hall. "This man taught me that dignity is priceless, and today he taught me who I will and will not choose to do business with." The silence was deafening. Thomas allowed himself a proud, quiet smile. 40 years of sacrifice had been worth it in that single moment. What Victoria didn't realize was that she had just sparked a war with the wrong man. The humiliation she intended would soon become the most costly mistake of her life. Because Daniel already knew, true character shows itself long before any contract is signed. If this story of injustice and payback moved you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Because what Daniel did next didn't just change his life, it rewrote the rules for an entire family who thought wealth could buy everything. And the story was only beginning. Thomas felt every word like a blade, but his face stayed calm. He had learned long ago that reacting only fed the pride of those who thrived on belittling others. Daniel, however, absorbed everything: the smirks, the whispered insults, the laughter that cut like glass. "My dad worked 40 years as an accountant," Daniel said evenly, his voice slicing through the noise. 3 jobs at once, so I could afford college." Victoria let out a theatrical laugh. "What a touching story. And now the little boy wants to play business with the grown-ups." She waved to the crowd. From neighborhood accountant to empire builder in just 1 generation. How quaint. But what no one in that room knew was that Thomas Carter had never been an ordinary accountant. For 4 decades, he had audited companies, exposed fraud, and uncovered financial schemes even seasoned lawyers couldn't detect. His reputation for integrity was legendary in courtrooms across the country. And while Victoria mocked, Thomas's mind drifted to late nights spent teaching Daniel how to read contracts, to Saturday mornings at the kitchen table, showing him how to balance books, to the day he watched his son close his first $1 million deal. "Richard," Victoria called to her husband loudly enough for everyone to hear, "perhaps we should reconsider this merger. Our reputation doesn't mix with certain backgrounds." The atmosphere shifted. Daniel didn't raise his voice, but the energy around him grew heavier, like a storm rolling across still waters. "Interesting perspective," he said, locking eyes with Richard, especially coming from someone whose fortune was built on inflated government contracts in the 80s. A stunned silence followed. Richard coughed on his cigar smoke, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Daniel smiled for the first time since arriving. It wasn't a friendly smile. "I research my business partners very carefully, Richard, especially those quick to judge." Victoria tried to seize control. "Now, young man." "No," Daniel interrupted firmly, but calmly. "You're going to listen." He turned to the guests, many of whom now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "My father taught me that character isn't inherited, it's built. That dignity isn't bought, it's earned, and that not all money is worth having." Thomas's heart swelled with pride, but also concern. He knew that determined look on his son's face, the same one Daniel had worn at age 12 when he swore no child of his would ever watch their father work 3 jobs just to survive. The Whitmores didn't realize every mocking word was being recorded on security cameras, on the discreet phones of younger guests. Every arrogant remark was evidence waiting to surface. Bradley Whitmore, the family's youngest son, finally muttered, "Maybe this joke went too far." "This isn't a joke," Thomas said suddenly, speaking for the first time since introductions. His calm voice carried authority that silenced even the laughter. "It's a lesson. You see people's true character when they believe there are no consequences." Victoria's smile hardened. "Security!" she called. 2 men in dark suits began moving forward. "We have some lost individuals who need to be escorted out." And that's when Daniel understood. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a declaration. The $1 billion deal, the pinnacle of his career, no longer mattered. Something far more important was now at stake. As the guards hesitated, clearly uneasy, Daniel's calm presence deepened. It was as though he had expected this escalation all along, as if he had been waiting for the Whitmores to reveal themselves fully before unveiling what he knew about them. Each insult, each attempt to humiliate, only fueled his resolve. His father's quiet dignity had taught him patience, but Daniel's knowledge of their darkest secrets would soon teach the Whitmores fear. Out in the parking lot, father and son walked in silence. Thomas tried to process the sting of what had happened. Daniel, on the other hand, was already 3 steps ahead, calculating his next move. "Dad," Daniel said softly, opening the door of the Lincoln Navigator. And in that moment, the true game began. "I need you to trust me now, more than ever," Daniel said softly. Thomas looked into his son's eyes and saw something familiar. The same unshakable resolve he himself had carried 4 decades earlier, when he had vowed never again to let anyone decide his worth based on his background or the size of his wallet. As they drove back to Manhattan, Daniel picked up the phone. "Nat," he said, his voice steady, "I need everything you can dig up on the Whitmores. Government contracts, sealed settlements, political ties, everything." On the other end, Natasha Rodriguez, his best friend since Harvard and one of New York's fiercest corporate attorneys, was already typing. "Daniel, what happened?" she asked. She recognized that tone. It meant war. They made the mistake of showing their true nature to the wrong person. For months, Daniel had quietly gathered background information on the Whitmores, just standard business prudence. But after that afternoon's humiliation, Every file, every report suddenly took on a new meaning. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore Country Club, the family celebrated what they thought was a victory. Victoria raised a glass of Dom Perignon, pride glowing in her voice. "Did you see how quickly they left?" Richard laughed. "As soon as we remind them who's in charge, they always back down." Bradley, the youngest son, looked uneasy. "Mom, maybe we went too far. Daniel Carter isn't exactly small time." "Please," Victoria waved him off. "A backyard businessman who grew too bold. He'll be back tomorrow, begging to sign." But as Victoria gloated, Daniel was already 40 stories above the streets of Manhattan in his own glass-walled boardroom. Natasha walked in carrying 3 boxes of files, followed by Marcus Williams, a former federal investigator who specialized in corporate crime. "You won't believe what we've uncovered in the last 6 months," Marcus said, spreading documents and photographs across the table. The evidence was damning. Inflated contracts with the Defense Department in the 1980s. Multi-million-dollar settlements quietly buried to cover workplace discrimination. Political favors greasing the way for shady environmental approvals. Natasha pointed to one page. "Here. A sealed $2 million settlement from 2010. A family forced into silence after filing a major lawsuit against Whitmore Industries. This isn't an isolated slip. It's a pattern that spans decades." Daniel leaned over the papers, every detail fueling his determination. His father's humiliation hadn't been a random insult. It was the latest chapter in a history of arrogance, written in ink and money. "There's more," Marcus added, connecting his laptop to the big screen. 7 former employees are ready to talk. They all signed silence agreements, but they're willing to break them. Thomas, who had stayed quiet through the entire briefing, finally spoke. "Son, did you know this would happen today?" Daniel turned, his eyes heavy but resolute. "I didn't know it would be you, Dad. But I knew sooner or later the Whitmores would expose themselves. People like them can't hide forever." Natasha cut in. "Daniel, listen carefully. The deal isn't officially dead yet. Technically, you could still walk back in tomorrow and sign." Daniel frowned. "Why would I ever do that?" She smiled, a sharp, fearless smile. "Because imagine their faces when they realize the man they tried to humiliate has enough evidence to crush not just their business, but their legacy. You won't just refuse them, you'll own the narrative." Daniel turned toward the window. Below, the city glowed with thousands of lights, each one representing families, dreams, futures shaped by decisions made in rooms like this one. Marcus broke the silence. "There's something else. That merger you walked away from, they need it more than you do. Without it, their company will hit a serious cash crisis in 18 months. For the first time since leaving the country club, Thomas smiled. "So, they need us more than we need them." "Exactly," Natasha confirmed. And with that, the balance of power shifted. And now Daniel held something the Whitmores had never expected. Not just the power to decide whether the deal went through, but the power to dictate the terms. He sat in silence for several minutes, weighing not only the financial leverage, but also the moral weight of his next move. This was no longer about a contract. It was about justice. When he finally looked up, his eyes carried an intensity that made his entire team realize something extraordinary was about to unfold. The humiliation of Thomas Carter had only been the spark. What was coming next would shake not just 2 families, but the very way power and prejudice collided when confronted with truth and strategy. The next morning, Daniel returned to the Whitmore Country Club, wearing the exact same suit as the day before. Victoria and Richard were waiting, radiant with confidence, flanked by lawyers and financial journalists, all gathered to witness what they thought would be the signing of a billion-dollar deal. "I knew you'd come back," Victoria smirked as Daniel approached the polished mahogany table where the contracts lay waiting. "People like you always crawl back when reality sets in." Daniel set his leather briefcase down calmly. "You're right, Victoria. I did come to sign an agreement today, just not the one you're expecting. Confusion flickered across Richard's face as Daniel opened the briefcase, but instead of a pen, he produced a sealed envelope. Before we discuss mergers, Daniel said evenly, we need to clear up a few misunderstandings about the Whitmore family. Victoria laughed, but it rang hollow. What is this little performance? Daniel opened the envelope and laid out photographs across the table. This is Jennifer Martinez, fired in 2010 after reporting harassment. Confidential settlement, $2 million. He slid more photos forward. Here we have Roberto Silva, 15 years of service, terminated after questioning why promotions never reached employees of color. Settlement, $1.5 million. The room fell into stunned silence. Richard's voice cracked. These are confidential documents. They were confidential. Daniel cut him off. Until 7 former employees broke their silence this morning. They're ready to testify publicly about the environment inside Whitmore companies. Victoria's face drained of color. You can't prove anything. Daniel clicked open his laptop and projected a spreadsheet onto the wall. 15 years of company data, 0 executives of color, termination rates triple for minority staff, salaries consistently lower for the same positions. Numbers don't lie. Victoria. The journalists in the room scrambled to capture every frame, cameras flashing. Richard tried to recover. This is an ambush. You can't. I can. And I will. Daniel connected a recorder to the sound system. Victoria's voice filled the hall. I'm sure there's some gardening work in the back if you're looking for a job. Followed by Richard's cruel laugh. Know your place. The room erupted in gasps. Victoria shot to her feet, her chair clattering to the floor. You had no right. Daniel stayed calm. It was a public setting. Multiple witnesses. Perfectly lawful. He switched off the recorder. And that was just the appetizer. At that moment, the doors opened. Natasha Rodriguez entered, carrying another heavy briefcase. Monsieur. Whitmore, she said firmly. I represent 7 former employees who, as of this morning, have filed a class action lawsuit against your companies. We are seeking $50 million in damages for systematic discrimination. Richard swayed, his face ashen. This is blackmail. This, Daniel replied, closing his briefcase, is justice. He turned to the journalists. And in 5 minutes, you'll all receive a complete dossier in your email, containing the recordings, sworn statements, and financial records you've just seen. The room was electric. Flashbulbs exploded. Panic spread across the Whitmore's faces. Victoria, desperate, tried one last move. You're destroying your own career. Victoria spat. No one will want to work with someone who breaks confidentiality. Daniel smiled for the first time with genuine satisfaction. Funny you mentioned confidentiality, Victoria, because I've just uncovered something fascinating about your government contracts from the 1980s. He motioned to Marcus Williams, who carried in heavy boxes of documents. Systematic tax fraud, defense contract overbilling, bribes to secure approvals, Marcus listed coolly. Most of it past the statute of limitations, but still enough to ruin any reputation left standing. Only then did Richard Whitmore finally grasp the scale of the disaster. This wasn't just an angry rival. They had provoked someone with resources, intelligence, and worst of all, patience. Bradley Whitmore, the youngest son, leaned toward his father and whispered, Dad, without the merger and with these lawsuits, the company won't last 6 months. Daniel heard him. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Bradley. You might be the only one in this family thinking clearly. I have a proposal. Don't you dare talk to my son, Victoria shrieked. Calm down, Mom, Bradley said, surprising everyone. He looked at Daniel. What proposal? Carter Logistics will buy Whitmore Industries' operating assets for 40 cents on the dollar, Daniel said. You'll keep your homes and a modest income. Or you can choose bankruptcy and years of public humiliation. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Victoria silenced him with a trembling hand. For the first time in decades, she had no words. Daniel gathered his documents. You have 48 hours. After that, the offer disappears, and you'll face the storm you created, alone. He walked toward the exit with Thomas at his side. Just before leaving, Daniel turned one last time. "Oh, and Victoria! Remember yesterday, when you suggested my father could work in the garden here? Well, as the new owner of this establishment, I might just take you up on that." The door slammed behind him, echoing like a judge's gavel. In the silence that followed, 3 generations of pride and prejudice began to collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. Within 24 hours, headlines swept across every news outlet. Billionaire family exposed in massive discrimination scandal. CEO walks away from billion-dollar merger after father insulted. Documents revealed decades of corruption and abuse. The fallout was brutal. Richard suffered a breakdown and was abandoned by his so-called friends. Victoria locked herself inside the mansion, refusing even to face the cameras. And Bradley, with a heavy heart, made the call Daniel had been expecting. "I accept your offer," he said, his voice weary. "My parents can't face reality, but I have children of my own, and I won't let them inherit this mess." 6 months later, the transformation was complete. The Whitmore Country Club was gone. In its place stood the Carter Community Center, a hub for music lessons, tutoring, and job training for underprivileged youth. Thomas Carter, now 64, strolled through the garden he had helped redesign, not as a hired hand, but as a volunteer mentor, teaching children how to plant and grow with their own hands. "Dad," Daniel said, watching a group of teenagers play violins in the hall where billionaires once dined. "Remember when she asked if you were looking for gardening work?" Thomas smiled, his hands covered in fresh soil. "She was right. I was looking for a gardening job. I just didn't realize it would be planting seeds of dignity where only arrogance had grown before." Carter Logistics didn't just survive without the Whitmore deal. It thrived, stronger than ever. But more importantly, the Carter family had rewritten the rules. Because in a world where power once belonged only to those with money and privilege, Daniel Carter proved that truth, dignity, and resilience could change the game forever. 3 major corporations, impressed by Daniel's ethical stance during the scandal, offered partnerships worth even more than the original Whitmore deal. Within a year, Carter Logistics employed over 5,000 people and introduced a diversity policy so strong it became a national model. Meanwhile, Victoria Whitmore became a complete social outcast. Invitations to galas and charity events vanished. Her beloved golf club revoked her lifetime membership. Even her stylists refused her calls. Richard, after being released from the hospital, retreated to a modest house in Florida, living in obscurity on a small pension from the forced sale. Bradley, the only Whitmore who faced reality, used his share of the proceeds to launch a nonprofit dedicated to fighting workplace discrimination. "My family caused pain for generations," he admitted in a televised interview that went viral. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to repair that damage." Natasha Rodriguez, now a minority partner at Carter Logistics, often joked at board meetings, "The Whitmores thought they were humiliating you. In reality, they handed us the biggest growth opportunity in our history on a silver platter." 1 year after the confrontation, Daniel received a national award for ethical business leadership. On stage, he dedicated it to his father. "Thomas Carter taught me that true power isn't about subjugating others. It's about lifting others higher. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's building a world where their prejudice no longer matters." In the audience, Thomas wiped away a tear as he applauded his son. Beside him sat Jennifer Martinez, Roberto Silva, and the 7 other former Whitmore employees, now thriving in leadership roles at Carter Logistics, their voices finally heard after years of forced silence. The story spread beyond the business world. Universities taught the Carter case in ethics courses. Young entrepreneurs cited Daniel as proof that moral values can outweigh any contract. And in communities where children still faced prejudice, the story of Thomas and Daniel became a tale of hope. Victoria never apologized. Even in ruin, she insisted she was the victim of a witch hunt. But the world had stopped listening. Her irrelevance was complete. Daniel understood at last. True victory didn't come from destroying the Whitmores, but from building something greater in the aftermath. Every employee promoted, every child trained at the Carter Community Centers, every family lifted up through opportunity was a more powerful response than any courtroom humiliation could provide. 2 years later, as Daniel cut the ribbon at the 10th Carter Community Center, Thomas stood beside him, clapping with the same hands Victoria had once mocked, hands now planting a legacy she could never comprehend. And the lesson was undeniable. When you turn injustice into fuel, you don't just defeat your oppressors, you render them irrelevant. There is no revenge more complete than success that makes your enemies realize they were never worthy of your attention in the first place. If this story of transformation inspired you, subscribe to the channel and share where you're watching from. Because sometimes the most powerful answer to hatred is to shine so brightly that no one can ever extinguish your light.